In this presentation, we're going to cover the approaches to ethics. Specifically, we're going to cover virtue and intuition, deontology, also referred to as principle-based ethics, and utilitarianism, also referred to as consequence-based ethics. And in our discussion of each of these, we're going to talk about the advantages and the disadvantages. So let's start with virtue and intuition. According to this approach, the basis of ethics is a set of qualities that defines what a good person is. The virtuous person manifests and acts on the characteristics that mark one as a person of character and integrity. The nature of ethical decision-making is intuitive. One grasps in a holistic way what a good person would do given a situation. The guiding impulse is that one should act on one's character. This approach is associated with Aristotle. And to Aristotle, the ultimate good is an active life in accord to excellence, and virtue is required to achieve excellence. Virtues are within us, but their utilization is not automatic. We have to choose to be good people. So there are some advantages to this approach. Ethical choices are intuitive. Essentially, one asks, who shall I be? There's an emphasis on goodness and doing good things. And this is an easily accessible approach to ethical standards because virtues commonly draw on core societal values that are taught from childhood. It is clearly an individual's choice to be virtuous, and there is less of a need to rely on or defer to an external authority. There are also disadvantages to this approach. Someone may not know what actions are appropriate for each virtue. We also may not be able to choose between alternative virtues that may lead one to act in different ways. And this can also lead to a sense of moral superiority. Only I know what's right, because goodness comes from within, and acting morally is such a part of your own character that if you take this to the extreme, then one person can come to the conclusion that they're doing the right thing because it's what they think they should be doing. And they have this moral sense of superiority. I can't be wrong. What I'm doing must be right. I am a good person. I do good things. Therefore, everything I do is good. But again, the nice part about this approach is that it is intuitive. You act kind of on your instincts as to what you think it means to act with integrity. And you do things according to that intuition. So let's switch our focus to deontology and the principle-based approach. Deontologists use agreed-upon values to determine one's moral obligation to act. Principles identify the kinds of action that are right, and at the basic level, we look to law to guide how we act. This approach is associated with Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant's approach says that ends or consequences attained by actions are not what determines a moral obligation. The moral worth of an action is determined by the principle from which that action is performed. One should only act as if one is legislating a universal law that everyone must follow in a preferred world. So before taking an action, you have to ask yourself, would I be okay with someone else doing this all the time? That this action is okay in itself, regardless of consequences. This action is good. So there are two basic principles to Kant's approach. People are never to be treated in an instrumental way, as a means to an end, but only as ends themselves. And one should never lie. There are certain principles that are accepted widely throughout Western society, things that you can act on that are consistent with this principle-based approach: truth-telling, promise-keeping, the sanctity of the individual, the sanctity of life, justice. But there are some issues with Kant's approach and the principle-based approach. So let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Some advantages: this provides an external source for ethical guidance. The principles are good reasons to act, not because of the consequences, but because of the principles are valid. So it's clear, in a sense, that you should act this way because this is the good thing to do. This reinforces a sense of duty to be ethical and provides guidance on how to act. One nice thing about the principle-based approach and the next approach we'll talk about with the consequence-based approach is that it does provide guidance of how to act. The virtue approach, virtue and intuition approaches really don't provide you any clear guidance of how to act. They don't say no one should ever lie, or you should lie because in this case, because the consequences are fine or good. So it does provide a clear guidance on how to act. Some of the disadvantages: how do we know that the principles are valid? Just because we have a society that has these agreed upon principles, how do we know that those are actually the right principles? This approach requires knowledge of those principles because they aren't intuitive. You don't just act on character. You have to know that something is widely accepted in culture and widely accepted in society, or you have to have knowledge that lying is wrong in order to avoid doing it. As an example, there's no guidance on how you order principles, and this may lack positive motives. So you could create a cold, calculating version of this approach. In a small example, we all tell white lies. Those would be totally unacceptable. But we could get cold, calculating versions of ourselves if we were truly never to tell a lie, or to take any of the other principles to their extremes. So let's talk about utilitarianism and the consequence-based approach. In this approach, there's an emphasis on the ends, the purposes, and the goals that result from actions rather than the principles that precede those actions. An action is right or wrong depending on its consequences. Pretty easy to understand. This approach is associated with John Stuart Mill, who argues that an action is good insofar as it contributes to good ends. So we should do what's best for the greater good. There's some advantages to this, besides the fact that it also provides guidance on how to act. One of the advantages that's also among those advantages of the principle-based approach too, that it does provide guidance of how to act, which is good. It's also conducive to public administrators who need to produce positive outcomes. This is where this is more specific to the kind of role you're in, because as public administrators, we're supposed to be acting in the public good. So the utilitarian approach, or the consequence-based approach, it is definitely conducive to the idea that public administrators need to be doing things that produce positive outcomes that are for the good of the community as a whole. And it's flexible. This is flexible. This allows some room for occasions where it is appropriate to either withhold the truth, maybe not flat out tell a lie, but withhold the truth, or tell a rather innocent lie, or be misleading. And then it also allows you to be truthful when appropriate, when that is going to come up with the best outcome. So this is flexible. Some of the disadvantages: it's not always possible to be aware of all of the consequences of an action. Just because you think what you're doing is going to be for the greater good, or going to benefit the most people, doesn't mean that that's actually the case. You may create more harm by lying, so, for example, than you do by telling the truth, even if you think the lie is going to lead to a good outcome. So we don't have a crystal ball. We can't always be sure that our consequences, that the consequences of our action are going to be good. This approach does leave us with an absence of the intrinsic worth of actions. So the nice thing about the principle-based approach is that we do good things because they are good, based on principle. Telling the truth is a good thing. There's no intrinsic worth to our actions in consequence-based approaches. They are only as good as their consequences. And this might also, especially in the context of being a public administrator, this might also turn into justifying actions that benefit the majority at the expense of the minority, and that can be dangerous too. That can lead to dangerous public outcomes. So in this presentation, we covered virtue and intuition, deontology, and the principle-based approach, and utilitarianism and the consequence-based approach. And we also talked about the different advantages and disadvantages to each of these approaches. And there's really no there's not a necessarily, as individuals, we're probably not perfectly fit into each of these approaches all totally. So there's probably times when you're acting based on principle, and there's times when you're acting based on the consequences, and that's an interesting thing to balance. So thank you,